I've told this story more than a few times now, usually to men who'd already believe it before I got to the ending, because they'd stood in a room like it themselves once and felt the air change without being able to say why. It happened on Drennan's Reach, a way station bolted onto the tail end of a dead comet lane, in a bar called the Low Roost that always smelled faintly of recycled air and burnt coffee, with a string of cracked glow tubes over the counter that nobody had gotten around to fixing in the 11 years I'd been drinking under them. I went there most evenings. Ash came with me. Ash is a Peregrine, 22 years old, most of her flight feathers gone the soft gray of an old dog's muzzle, one eye clouded pale at the rim from a scar she picked up long before I met her. She rides the back of the corner stool most nights and does nothing at all, doesn't twitch when the jukebox screeches, doesn't lift her head when some trader knocks his chair over reaching for the last basket of fried root. She retired from the handler corps the same season I did, and we'd both settled into the quiet business of sitting in a corner while the room did its work around us. People forgot she was there. Half the regulars used her stool as a hat rack when she wasn't on it. That was the job now, and neither of us minded it. I'd been assigned to Drennan's Reach for the last 2 years of my service, running perimeter checks with Ash on scent and sight work. Nobody else in the Corps wanted anymore, because it was slow, unglamorous, and made for terrible recruitment footage. When my papers came through, I stayed on the station anyway. I told people it was the pension housing, which was true enough, but it was also that Ash had never lived anywhere else, and I wasn't going to be the one who dragged a 22-year-old bird across 3 jump lanes just to prove I still had somewhere better to be. The night it happened, the station's public feed cut mid-sentence and came back with an evacuation order. Some fault in the reactor ring. Nothing anybody in the Low Roost understood past the single word, evacuation, repeating in flat station standard over the bar's speaker. Within a minute, the room had gone from half full to shoulder, workers pouring in off the concourse because the Roost had the only door on that level wide enough for a crowd, and somebody's memory of it being sturdier than the corridor outside. Voices climbed. Someone's kid started crying near the door. A woman near the bar kept saying, quiet and useless, it's fine, to nobody in particular. Behind them came 4 Voran enforcement, tall, gray-skinned, jointed wrong at the elbow. The kind of species that talks in short, flat barks even when they mean well. They pushed into the doorway with stun batons up, shouting for the crowd to clear a lane so the corridor wouldn't choke, and the crowd, already frightened, read the batons as the second emergency of the night and surged the other way, toward the back wall, toward the corner, toward us. I want to be clear, I didn't do anything. I was an old man on a bar stool with an older bird near my elbow, and when 60-some frightened people started moving as one animal toward the corner where Ash and I sat, there wasn't a thing in my 2 hands that would have stopped it. I said easy under my breath, the way I used to say it to green cadets on their first bad day, though I'll admit, I wasn't sure who I meant it for. I put my arm up out of some old instinct to shield her, and that was the whole of my contribution to what happened next. Ash opened her eyes. That's the entire event, if you want it stripped down to what actually occurred. She'd had them shut for probably 4 hours, since the dinner crowd thinned out. She opened them, turned her head a few slow degrees toward the oncoming crowd, and did not move another muscle. No flare of the wings, no cry, nothing you'd call a threat by any definition a person would use. She looked at 60 running strangers the way she'd once looked at 1,000 rabbits from 400 feet up. Entirely unbothered, entirely unhurried, like whatever was coming toward her had already been measured and found to be nothing worth the trouble. The first 3 rows of the crowd stopped like they'd hit glass. I found out afterward why, because a Voran corporal named Ilith Carr was decent enough to sit with me once the room had settled and explain what her own people had seen. The Voran keep hunting birds too, or something close enough that the shape reads the same to their eye. A species called the Ketfral, bonded from birth to a single handler. A Ketfral in genuine danger goes rigid, feathers locked flat, eyes wide and fixed, every muscle screaming the alarm a half second before it breaks and flies. It's the oldest signal their people have, older than language. But a ketvral that stays loose, that opens its eyes slow and settles back into stillness, is a ketvral that has already decided there is nothing in the room worth its attention. To a Vorin, that isn't calm. That's a verdict. Read off an animal that cannot lie about it. So when 60 humans and half a dozen other species were running blind on instinct, and 4 armed enforcers were shouting orders nobody could hear over their own fear, it was Ash, one gray old bird, half asleep on a bar stool in a bar that smelled like burnt cafe, who told the room, in the one language every hunting species on that station actually shared, that there was nothing here worth the run. The crowd didn't understand why they'd stopped. Most told me later, they simply felt the fear go out of their legs, like someone had thrown a switch they didn't know was wired to them. But the corporal understood immediately, and so did the 3 enforcers behind her, and all 4 lowered their batons in the same breath, like something they'd been holding tight had finally been let go. The evacuation order turned out to be a sensor fault, nothing more, corrected 40 minutes later with an apology broadcast that nobody in the low roost bothered to listen to, because by then, the crowd had already sorted itself back into tables. The crying kid had a lollipop he hadn't earned, the jukebox was working again, and Ash had put her head back under her wing, like none of it had cost her a single feather. Corporal Carr came and sat across from me once the room settled, and asked, careful as though she wasn't sure the question was allowed, whether the bird always did that. I told her Ash hadn't hunted in 9 years, hadn't so much as stretched a wing past the width of that stool in longer than that, and that as far as I could tell, the only job left in her was deciding, once in a great while, whether a room was worth waking up for. Carr looked at Ash a long time after that, the way you look at something you've been taught to read your whole life, and are only now seeing clearly. Then she looked back at me and said something in her own language I didn't catch, and when I asked what it meant, she told me it didn't translate clean, but the closest she could get was this: the ones who stop being afraid first are the ones who were never really prey to begin with. I've turned that line over more than I probably should since. I'm 68 years old, and I spent the working half of my life training birds to read a threat before any man in my unit could, and it took a frightened corporal on a way station with a broken reactor feed to hand me the truth of it, plainer than I ever managed to say it myself. The fear in that room didn't break because anyone fought it. It broke because one old animal, half blind in one eye, looked straight at it and decided, without a flicker, that it wasn't worth the trouble of staying awake for. Ash is asleep on the stool beside me again tonight, same as she usually is. The jukebox is too loud. Somebody 2 tables over is arguing about a cargo manifest like it's the end of the world, and none of it reaches her. I've stopped waiting for the day she quits being enough to settle a room, because I don't think that day was ever about her feathers, or the clouded eye, or the 22 years sitting on her like dust. I think it's only ever been about whether she opens her eyes at all, and so far, every single time it's mattered, she has decided we're fine. Carr still comes by the low roost sometimes, off shift, and sits at the bar without ordering anything, just watching Ash sleep the way you'd watch whether you respected. I asked her once if it bothered her, knowing a bird could read a room faster than 4 armed officers, with a mandate to keep the peace. She said no, that a station with an old bird like Ash in the corner could always tell you, for free, whether tonight was one worth being afraid of. I didn't have much to add. I just poured her a drink she wasn't going to touch, and let us sit there a while, watching an old Peregrine do absolutely nothing, which was, as far as I've ever managed to tell, the hardest and most honest job either of us had left.